If the Supreme Court just drew a line today, who just lost the ability to cross it? That's the question sitting quietly at the center of this moment. Not because of anything dramatic you might have seen on television, and not because anyone raised their voice, but because just moments ago, the Supreme Court of the United States did what it does when it intends to be unmistakably clear. It said no calmly, firmly, and without leaving room for reinterpretation. When that happens, something shifts. Not on the surface, where headlines race each other, but underneath, or where power is actually defined. This wasn't a ruling meant to embarrass anyone. Courts don't operate that way. This was a decision that quietly closed a door, and once the Supreme Court closes a door, it rarely opens again. What makes this moment so unsettling and so important is how little drama accompanied it. No sharp language, no public rebuke. Just a legal conclusion that stripped an argument of its force, and in doing so placed a limit on power that had long been assumed. At the center of this is Donald Trump, but this isn't about personality. See, it isn't about politics as theater. It's about authority meeting its boundary, about what happens when the highest court in the land decides that a claim of power goes too far, not emotionally, but constitutionally. I want you to stay with me here, especially those of you watching from the United States and those joining from the United Kingdom and Canada, because moments like this are easy to misunderstand. They don't look explosive. They don't feel urgent at first glance, but they're the ones that quietly reshape how power operates going forward. If you value calm explanation over noise, if you care about understanding what courts actually do when they speak this way, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who still believes the rule of law matters, and subscribe so we can keep having these conversations together. I don't ask that lightly. For those of us who've lived long enough to see institutions tested before, understanding these signals is part of staying grounded. Because here's what most people will miss. The Supreme Court didn't just reject an argument today. It rejected a way of thinking about power. And once that happens, the consequences don't arrive all at once. They unfold slowly, deliberately, and with lasting effect. So before we talk about politics, before we talk about headlines, we need to understand what this ruling means legally, why it landed the way it did, and why in the long run this may matter far more than it appears right now. What makes this ruling feel different isn't just the outcome. It's the way the court arrived there. The Supreme Court didn't argue, it didn't negotiate, and it didn't signal uncertainty. It simply refused to accept a claim of authority that had been treated for a long time as if it were expandable. That distinction matters because courts don't humiliate people. They humiliate ideas. And the idea the court rejected here wasn't small and wasn't technicals and wasn't accidental. It was the belief that power could stretch further than the Constitution allows if pressed hard enough, or loudly enough, or often enough. This is where many people misunderstand how the Supreme Court actually speaks. When the court is divided, you hear it. When it's unsure, you see it in careful language and narrow reasoning. But when it believes a line has been crossed, the language tightens. Options disappear. The message shifts from persuasion to correction. I've seen this kind of ruling before, not many times, but enough to recognize the signal. It's the difference between a loss you can work around and a loss that follows you, one that changes, how future arguments are received before they're even made. And here's the part that's easy to miss in the rush to react. This wasn't the court saying, you didn't win. This was the court saying, this approach does not belong here. That's a much heavier statement in legal terms. It tells lower courts what not to entertain. It tells future litigants where not to go, and it tells anyone watching that the boundary has been reinforced. For those of us who've lived long enough to see institutions tested before, this moment feels familiar, not alarming, but clarifying. It's the law reminding power that it operates within a framework it didn't create and cannot rewrite on its own. And that's why the reaction among legal experts has been so strong. They understand that when the Supreme Court closes a door this firmly, it's not reacting to a single case. It's shaping the terrain for everything that comes after. Which brings us to the question we need to answer next. What exactly was the court unwilling to accept? And why does that refusal matter far beyond this one ruling? At the center of this decision wasn't a personal judgment. It was a refusal. The court was asked to accept a particular way of understanding power, that authority could be exercised more broadly, more flexibly, and with fewer limits than the Constitution has traditionally allowed. And the court declined that refusal is the real story, because the Supreme Court didn't just say this argument fails in this case. It said this argument does not fit within the structure of the law. That distinction matters more than it sounds. A failed argument can be revised, reshaped, and brought back again. A rejected framework rarely gets a second invitation. What was being tested here was the idea that certain actions could be shielded simply by position, by timing, or by asserted necessity. Courts hear claims like that often. Sometimes in very narrow circumstances they allow them, but this time the court made something unmistakably clear. The boundary itself mattered more than the justification offered to cross it. And for anyone who has dealt with contracts, property lines, or long-standing agreements, this instinctively makes sense. You don't get to redefine the rules after the fact just because following them has become inconvenient. The terms either hold or the system becomes unstable. What the court did here was quietly drive the stake back into the ground, this far and no further. Not because of who was asking, but because of what was being asked. That's how constitutional limits are maintained. Not loudly, not emotionally, but firmly and without apology. I've watched cases where parties assumed the court would bend because the stakes felt too high not to. And when the court didn't, the realization came slowly, not in outrage, but in recalculation. Because once a court makes clear that a certain claim of authority will not be entertained, every future decision has to adjust around that reality. That's why legal scholars reacted so quickly to this ruling. They understood the court wasn't just resolving a dispute, it was clarifying a boundary that had been allowed to blur. And when boundaries are clarified at this level, they don't stay contained to one case. They ripple outward, shaping how power is exercised, how it's challenged, and how it's restrained from this point forward. That's the part most headlines will miss. The ruling wasn't dramatic, but it was definitive. And once the Supreme Court defines what power cannot do, the conversation changes. The question is no longer how far authority can stretch. It's how it will operate inside the limits that have now been unmistakably reaffirmed. What made this moment land so forcefully in legal circles wasn't just what the court decided, it was how it decided it. Not all Supreme Court rulings speak with the same weight. Some leave doors open, some hedge, some quietly invite a second attempt with better wording. This one didn't. The Supreme Court of the United States chose language that was disciplined, narrow, and unmistakably final in tone. No invitation to try again later, no suggestion that a slightly different argument might succeed, just a clean refusal to adopt a claim of authority the court found incompatible with the Constitution's structure. And this is where people misunderstand what humiliation means in a legal sense. Courts don't embarrass people with words. They do it by omission, by declining to engage, by refusing to legitimize an argument, by writing as if a claim simply doesn't belong in the conversation at all. In law, that's devastating because once the Supreme Court treats an argument that way, lower courts take notice. Lawyers take notice. Future cases adjust before they're even filed. I've watched this happen before. When an argument didn't just lose, it lost standing. Judges downstream stop experimenting with it. Attorneys stop relying on it, not because it's controversial, but because it's been marked as incompatible with the legal framework itself. That's why legal experts reacted so quickly to this decision. They understood this wasn't a narrow loss or a close call. It was a structural defeat, the kind that quietly narrows what power can ask for next time, the kind that follows you into future cases long after the headlines fade. And this is where the court's message becomes unmistakable. Not outrage, not condemnation, limitation, a reminder that the Constitution is not elastic and that authority does not expand simply because it insists. When the court writes this way, it isn't negotiating with power, it's containing it. And once containment begins at this level, the effects don't stop with one ruling. They shape what comes next, how arguments are framed, and how much room power is given to move from this point forward. Here's where many people assume the story is over and where the law quietly says not yet. Because the most important effects of a Supreme Court defeat don't show up immediately. They show up later in what can no longer be argued. This is the moment that separates a temporary loss from a lasting constraint. When the court rejects an argument this cleanly, it doesn't just decide today's case. It reshapes tomorrow's options. From this point forward, every lawyer considering a similar claim has to pause. Every judge reviewing a related issue has to account for what the court just said and what it deliberately refused to say. This is how power begins to narrow, not suddenly, but step by step. I've watched this pattern unfold over time. At first, nothing looks different. The same faces appear by the same confidence is projected, but behind the scenes, strategies change. Arguments are softened. Claims that once sounded bold are suddenly framed more cautiously or abandoned altogether. Because once the Supreme Court has drawn a line, lower courts don't cross it lightly. And here's the part that rarely gets explained. This kind of defeat follows a person into every future courtroom, not as a punishment, but as a reference point. Judges remember, clerks remember, the record remembers. So the next time authority is asserted, it's weighed against what the court already rejected. That's why this moment matters more tomorrow than it does today, and that's why legal experts reacted so strongly. They understand that power doesn't disappear after a ruling, but it does lose room to maneuver. This is the quiet consequence most people miss. The ruling doesn't shout, it doesn't threaten, it simply reduces the space in which power can move. And once that space begins to shrink, every step forward becomes more careful, more scrutinized, and far less certain, which brings us to the people who understand this instinctively, often better than anyone else. This is where those of you who've lived a little longer often understand what's happening faster than anyone else because you've seen this before. Not in this case, but in life. You know the difference between noise and consequence, between a dramatic moment and a structural change. For seniors especially, power isn't an abstract idea. It shows up in very real ways. In whether property rights are respected, in whether benefits are honored, in whether courts remain places of steadiness or become places of pressure. That's why moments like this land differently for people who've spent decades relying on systems to work quietly, predictably, and treatably, and fairly. When the Supreme Court limits authority this clearly, it sends a signal that goes far beyond one person or one case. It says the rules still apply even when it's uncomfortable, even when the stakes are high, even when the spotlight is bright. If you've ever waited months for a court decision that affected your home, your finances, or your family, you already understand the value of this instinctively. You weren't looking for drama. You were looking for steadiness. Courts exist for that exact reason, not to reward emotion, not to validate power, but to slow things down when pressure builds. And that's why this ruling matters so much to people who may never step inside that courtroom. It's not about who won or lost today. It's about whether the guardrails still hold. Because once courts begin to bend under pressure, everyone feels it eventually, especially those who depend on consistency more than influence. This moment, quiet as it may seem, was a test of that steadiness. And the court's response was deliberate for a reason. Not rushed, not theatrical, measured. Which brings us to the longer view, the part of this story that unfolds well beyond today's decision. When you look at this through a longer lens, this is where the constitutional stakes come fully into view. Supreme Court decisions are not written for one moment nor one political season. They're written to last, to shape behavior long after the headlines fade. That's why this ruling wasn't framed around punishment. It was framed around prevention. The court wasn't looking backward. It was looking ahead. It was asking a quiet but powerful question. If this claim of authority is accepted today, what does it allow tomorrow? That's how constitutional law actually works. It anticipates repetition. It guards against expansion. It draws lines early so they don't have to be redrawn in crisis later. Those of you who remember earlier periods when institutions were tested will recognize this instinct immediately. Courts step in not when things are already broken, but when they see a pattern forming that could break them later. This is why restraint matters so much at this level. The Constitution doesn't protect democracy by reacting loudly. It protects it by setting limits before power convinces itself those limits no longer apply. And when the Supreme Court reinforces a boundary like this, it isn't speaking only to one individual. It's speaking to every future office holder, every future administration, every future moment when authority is tempted to stretch. That's the long game here. Not embarrassment, not political fallout, but a reminder written into precedent that power in this system is borrowed, not owned. For seniors especially, this kind of constitutional restraint feels familiar. It echoes lessons learned the hard way that strong systems survive because they say no at the right moment, not because they say yes too often. This ruling did exactly that. And while its effects won't be felt overnight, they will shape how authority is exercised, challenged, and contained for years to come. Which brings us back to the present and to why this moment felt so striking to those who understand how courts speak when they intend to be remembered. What made legal experts react so quickly to this ruling? That wasn't outrage. It was recognition. They understood something immediately. The court didn't just close a door, it removed the hallway leading to it. There's an important difference in law between losing narrowly and losing structurally. A narrow loss leaves room, a different argument, a different court, a different moment. A structural loss does not. And this was structural. The Supreme Court didn't leave space for reinterpretation. It didn't suggest a workaround. It didn't hint that the same claim might succeed under slightly different circumstances. Instead, it defined what cannot be done. That matters enormously going forward, because once the court does that, every future assertion of authority is measured against this ruling first. Not emotionally, not politically, legally. This is why power feels the impact here, even if nothing looks different on the surface. Future filings become more cautious. Future arguments are framed more narrowly. Judges lower down the chain become less patient with claims that resemble what the Supreme Court has already rejected. I've watched this happen before. An argument that once sounded bold suddenly feels risky. A strategy that once felt confident becomes defensive, not because anyone was shamed, but because the terrain changed. And this is the part most people don't see. Supreme Court defeats don't end conversations. They redirect them often into much smaller spaces. That's what happened here. Power didn't disappear, but it lost flexibility. It lost leverage, and it lost the benefit of the doubt. From this point forward, every move is made with this ruling in mind, which is why this moment hit so hard legally, even though it looked calm on the surface, and it's why the real consequences won't show up in headlines today, but in the limits that quietly shape what happens next. There's a moment in stories like this when the law stops feeling distant and starts feeling human, not because the rules change, but because the pressure reveals something real. Courtrooms have a way of doing that. They strip away performance. They remove the noise. And what's left is how power behaves when it's told quietly that it has limits. I've always thought of courts as mirrors, not moral ones, but structural ones. They don't ask who someone claims to be. They reflect who someone is when the rules apply evenly, when the record is permanent, and when there's nowhere left to argue around the edges. That's why moments like this linger, not because they decide everything, but because they reveal something important. They show how authority responds when it's constrained, how it recalibrates or resists, and even after years around courtrooms. Moments like this still stay with me. I remember watching a judge once after a major ruling had just been issued. There was no reaction in the room, no commentary, just a sense that the balance had shifted. Later, that judge said something quietly, almost as an aside. Now we see how this will be handled. That stayed with me because that's what courts are always watching for. Not just compliance, but adaptation. For those of you watching who have lived through moments where institutions were tested, where rules mattered more than personalities, this probably feels familiar. It's not the loud clashes you remember most clearly. It's the moments when something subtle changed and you knew things wouldn't quite work the same way again. This ruling fits that pattern. It didn't announce a new era. It didn't demand attention. It simply reminded power that it operates inside a structure, not above it. And when that reminder comes from the highest court in the land, it doesn't fade quickly. It settles in, which brings us to the final question. What this moment ultimately leaves behind and why. Even in its quietness, it matters more than many people realize. When everything settles where and the noise moves on, this is what remains. Not outrage, not celebration. The record carefully written, patiently reviewed, and governed by rules designed to outlast moments exactly like this one. Courts don't rush to conclusion, and they don't bend easily to pressure. That isn't a flaw. It's the safeguard. Accountability in law is rarely loud. It unfolds slowly through reasoning, through precedent, through decisions that don't seek approval because they don't need it. For those of you watching from the United States and for those joining from the United Kingdom and Canada, this is why moments like this matter. Not because every ruling signals a crisis, but because understanding how the law actually responds helps separate substance from spectacle. It reminds us that even when power pushes, the system still knows how to push back quietly and with discipline. If you value conversations like this, calm, careful, and grounded in how courts really work, I hope you'll stay with us. Take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes the rule of law still matters, and subscribe so we can keep making sense of these moments together. I don't ask that casually because these conversations aren't meant to inflame. They're meant to steady, to help us recognize the difference between noise that passes and decisions that last. As this story continues, remember this. The most consequential actions in court are often the least visible. A line drawn without drama an argument rejected without insult, a boundary reinforced without apology. Those are the moments that shape what happens next long after the cameras are gone. And if you'd like to continue this conversation, you'll see another video waiting on the left side of your screen. It's part of the same effort to stay informed, to stay grounded, and to understand how the law protects stability even when power resists it. Stay curious, stay steady, and stay engaged.